if you're targeting would-be reform voters, that's quite an interesting point for Boris Johnson to then use in the next parliament. If you have Nigel Farage in parliament trying to take over as leader of the Conservative Party, then you could, anything's possible with Boris Johnson. You could possibly have Boris Johnson trying to return to parliament and become leader of the Conservative Party, saying, actually, I'm the person who can see off reform.
To look at what's happening in campaigning today, political commentator Isabel Hardman can take stock for us. Good morning, Isabel.
Good morning.
There appear to be two strategies at play from the Conservatives, as manifested in how they talked to us on this programme. There's the Grant Shapps strategy, which is to sag your shoulders and say everything's all up, you can only fight for a better loss. Or Mark Spencer to channel his inner Boris and be a bit bullish about it and say, yes, of course we can still win. Does it matter that those two strategies appear to be directly at odds with one another?
Firstly, I absolutely love your concern for Grant Shapps' mental well-being on this programme, given how sad he's looked whenever you've spoken to him. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think it's actually, if you looked at it as a lawyer, it is a contradiction between what Rishi Sunak or Mark Spencer are saying about believing that they can still win, and what Grant Shapps said to you, where he said that he's a realist, it's not the most likely outcome, but there is still a chance that the Conservatives could win the election. It's just that they're doing it in slightly different ways, and I think for slightly different audiences. Now, you always need the Prime Minister to offer, I suppose, a willing suspension of disbelief that he actually does really think that they can win, because no one's going to go out on the doorstep otherwise. But to send other people like Grant Shapps out now, it seems on a weekly basis, to warn that the Conservatives are going to win, is a way, firstly, of depressing the Labour vote, because Labour voters are less likely to turn out anyway, but also even less likely if they think that it's in the bag and they just don't need to worry in their seat, and to also put the fear into would-be Labour voters about the possibility of a Labour government. Now, this does rely on people being freaked out by Keir Starmer, which was a strategy that the Tories also had back in 1997. You remember their New Labour, New Danger posters with the sort of the scary eyes coming out of the purse. This time around, we've got a rather cute piggy bank, which is even less scary. But in neither election were voters scared enough of Labour. Actually, the groundwork had been done to change that party and to allay voters' fears.
And that's an interesting point, because also some people made the point, because Mark Spencer came on and said, you could have Labour for 20 years. Well, if people vote Tory in this election, you'd have Tory for 18 years. And this notion that is a fearsome prospect, it is fearsome to some people, but is it fearsome to enough is a legitimate question, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's also because they're not able to really pin anything on Labour in particular, because Labour haven't really told us what they're going to do. There's nothing particularly to be scared of. So, it's not saying that, I mean, the biggest thing they've got is private school fees, which only a very small percentage of the population are going to be aerated about. Beyond that, they're saying, well, Labour needs to rule out this tax rise, they need to rule out that tax rise. And yes, you can deploy the power of the voters' imagination and talk about £2,000 and so on. But that very quickly becomes mired in well, hang on, you've got the biggest tax burden post-war. So It's not as though you're the party of fabulously low taxes. So it's difficult to scare voters because there's nothing really to scare them with. And I think for a lot of people, and that's probably why the polls are where they are, the prospect of 20 years of Labour may not be that attractive, but it may be less unattractive than another period of Conservatives in power.
What about Project Shilly Shally, which is how Labour deal with this tax issue? We've had, we do this a lot on our programme because we have a round, and so we had Jonathan Ashworth yesterday saying, yes, it was a promise, they could rule out changing council tax bands. We've subsequently had Rachel Reeves on saying, well, I don't know. We just had Jonathan Reynolds on saying he can't rule it out either. Same with capital gains tax. Presumably, the approach is to say they don't need to rule anything out because they're so far ahead. And maybe we should stop asking them. Maybe it matters less. What do you make of Labour's tax position and indeed wretched representatives of the media like Asma and I asking them questions about it?
Yeah, will you just stop asking them questions? Goodness me. Look, they've got to leave themselves with wriggle room, haven't they? Because after the election, they need to be able to say, oh, now we've looked at the books and it's much worse than we thought. And that's exactly what they're going to say, because the other thing they say, as well as not ruling anything out on your programme, is, well, we need to look at the books properly. Now, they don't want to talk about tax rises in this campaign. The other side of their strategy is to say, well, the Tories are just as bad, which has been a real theme, I think, of British politics over the past few years, which is, well, you're worse than us, which is quite dispiriting, really. But their focus is on the Tories claiming that they can fund tax cuts by getting £12 billion of savings from the welfare budget. And that's what their big focus yesterday was on, because Jeremy Hunt had written to his constituents suggesting, Labour say he was suggesting that the 12 billion had already been announced. It had, but I think the argument from the Conservatives is that the saving hasn't arrived yet, and that's how they can then fund future tax cuts, because this was a recent announcement of a programme that they're only really just getting going with.
Yeah, the point you make is a very good one, though, because the Tories have led to high taxes, so tax is a very tricky area for them to necessarily score points on. Before you go, Isabel, where are we on Boris Johnson? He's writing tens of thousands of letters. Well, he's probably done one letter and put it in a photocopier. He's doing a couple of videos where he always goes, "Hi, folks, Boris Johnson here," and sort of does the same old shtick he does before. Is he an asset? Could he be more of an asset? Is he probably secretly hoping Rishi Sunak gets tonked?
Yeah, there's still no love lost between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. And he's being used now by Isaac Levido, the party's campaign chief, to target voters who are minded to back reform. They're probably potentially more likely to think that Boris Johnson was deposed unfairly by, a faction in his party, by an establishment plot, depending on whose book you read.
So who's now the Prime Minister, though, by Rishi Sunak's part of that, actually.
Yes, exactly. So he's written these letters. I suppose it's, he's not appearing on the campaign trail with Rishi Sunak. He's not appearing on doorsteps. And that's partly, as you say, because he doesn't want to be too closely associated with this defeat. But if you're targeting would-be reform voters, that's quite an interesting point for Boris Johnson to then use in the next Parliament. If you have Nigel Farage in Parliament trying to take over as leader of the Conservative Party, then you could, anything's possible with Boris Johnson. You could possibly have Boris Johnson trying to return to Parliament and become leader of the Conservative Party, saying, actually, I'm the person who can see off reform.
That's really interesting. There's this poll by YouGov on if the Conservative Party loses the election in July, which of their prime ministers since 2010 do you think will be most responsible? Isabel, the winner, if you can call it a winner, was Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was seen as more blameworthy than Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss in that order. So he's not an unmixed asset, is he?
He's not, and it depends who gets re-elected in terms of the Conservative MPs and I suppose candidates who are standing in this election, because if you have a lot of standard bearers of the right losing their seats, which they may well do according to a lot of the seat-by-seat polling that we've seen, then you'll have a lot of One Nation MPs who've made it clear that they would rather quit the party than be led again by Boris Johnson. He's not standing in this election, so there are mechanics that would need to be overcome, but he's overcome many things that people have said are impossible before. But yeah, that he's not loved across the country. He's not loved in his own party. And the idea that this would be the answer to Tory turmoil and would stop a Conservative meltdown is far-fetched.
I think that's a very fair point. Isabel, great to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Isabel Hardman there, the political commentator.